McLean. Dick Coach's Corner.
You're listening to the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast with your host, Andy Plimer.
For someone to explain.
Bringing you up-to-date coaching concepts from the world of rugby. Sharing ideas to make the game better.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining for episode 28. Before we start with the show, I just wanted to say a few thank yous to some people who've gone onto iTunes and given the show a rating. I really appreciate that because it makes the show easier for people to find when they search for podcasts on iTunes. So thanks massively for the people who went out of their way to do that. From the US, Rugby Steve 2, Richmond Rugby, and Chris Kovac. Chris is an Aussie, I believe, who's in the US. So thanks a lot to those people for signing in and doing a review. From the UK, got a nice review from Fat Fudd. Pretty sure that's not his real name, but thanks a lot anyhow, Fat Fudd. And then from Canada, there's Lieutenant Demo, and then Stu Ball, the racehorse mofo, gave me a really nice review for the show. So thanks a lot to those listeners. And yeah, if you have the time, like I said, it really elevates the show in iTunes searches. If you can come on and give a review, give an honest review, that'd be greatly appreciated. And secondly, releasing this episode during National Coaches Week here in Canada. It's an initiative set up by the Coaching Association of Canada. Just an initiative to say thanks to all the coaches out there, no matter what sport they're in, for the work they do, majority of it being volunteer. So I just want to use this opportunity to give a shout out to all coaches out there coaching rugby, passing on this beautiful game that we all love. No matter what country you're listening in, just really want to say thanks for downloading the show, listening to it, giving me any feedback. I'll get a bunch of emails and just really appreciate people listening to the show and I just hope it can provide a resource for you to pass on to your players. So without further ado, let's get into episode number 28 with Dr. Kelly Starrett. I'm your host, Andy Plimer, and joining me today is Dr. Kelly Starrett. Dr. Starrett is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Becoming a Supple Leopard, which has revolutionized how coaches, athletes, and everyday humans approach movement and athletic performance. He's the co-founder of San Francisco CrossFit and the website mobilitywod.com, where he shares his innovative approach to movement mechanics and mobility. He travels around the world teaching his widely popular movement and mobility course and works with elite athletes from the NFL, NBA, NHL, and a bunch of other sports. He's also worked with a number of professional rugby clubs and players, including the Harlequins. He believes that every human being should know how to move and be able to perform basic maintenance on themselves. And it's a pleasure to have you on the show, Kelly. So welcome.
Oh, thanks very much, man.
Yeah, no worries. Quite an extensive bio there. What got you into kind of the field of mobility, and it's probably a strength and conditioning pathway initially?
Yeah, well, when we're talking about, I've been at coaching, courses and in groups of like stud coaches, Olympic lifting coaches, speed coaches, powerlifting coaches, and to choose the stretching guy, it's not cool. I mean, really, let's be honest. What we ultimately ended up doing is taking the word mobility and use it as a surrogate for stretching. It's really where we've gone, but what really is the heart and soul. And the reason I'm in the right place is we're talking about positional competency. And what we don't realize is how much force we're leaving on the table, how many, because we don't have access for whatever reason to our full range of motion and basic, full capacities. And some of it is because we're under heavy loads and we've been running into each other for a long time and didn't know that it was important. Because we are really such excellent compensators, we end up creating a lot of extra work for the body to manage. One of our wheels on the front of the car is turned out a little bit, and you can still drive 100 miles an hour, but you're going to create some speed wobbles and wear out a tire. And what we've really seen is, we were having conversations with really good athletes whom you could not outwork anymore.
Yeah.
The work thresholds are very, very high these days for our athletes. And the turnaround and what we're expecting around conditioning and strength and play, really, really high demands. And then if we also saw that our athletes were able to work really hard but didn't have fundamental understanding. They were folding themselves into shapes under the bar, into the scrum. The same thing would happen, and then wonder why we had spondy or why we were ended up with low back pain or low back pump out, and not being able to connect the dots between how we were practicing, in the gym, the reinforcements, and carrying those deficient motor patterns into the pitch. And subsequently, what we saw was that there's a whole bunch of silly things that we could take off the table and make athletes more robust and get more work out of them. And that's how we, sort of stumbled into this, rugby, I'll just come out and say it, is just gorgeous sport. It's gorgeous, right?
Absolutely.
And it really is. And fun to see women's rugby. I went to school at CU in Boulder, Colorado, and we had a pretty good club team at the time, just a little university club team. But it was all really good athletes, who maybe didn't want to play college football, American football. And, what we have a lot of conversations around our gym and our coaching crew about who maybe is the best all-around athlete. And it turns out like rugby always pops up to the top. Our general manager of our business, of our gym, is a big rugby fan. One of our physios is a rugby fan. We really feel like, the ability to run and cut and tackle and throw, and these are like some of the fundamental building blocks of human movement, which means that it's really ripe to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah.
And what we've done in the past is said, as long as you're brutally strong and you can run all day, you're going to be good enough, right? And the solutions were, let's run more, let's get brutally stronger. And suddenly we're realizing, man, what is it about a guy like Jared Haynes that makes him such an extraordinary, athlete? And then how do we reproduce that? How do we get more out of our athletes in the long haul? And I think that's what's really interesting about this game and this sport. We're going to have contact injuries. That's, it actually is a collision sport.
Yeah, for
not,
sure.
Not a contact sport, but the other things we can just take off the table, and we should.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the World Cup just gone, there was a big piece of conversation about how many injuries were occurring out of contact, and that really that some people think that's inexcusable. That's you trace that back, and something's gone really wrong for that athlete for them to have a non-contact injury.
Well, we're not really, I say rugby is definitely not the only sport that has non-contact injuries, and it's a complicated problem. And it doesn't mean that we can't improve the ecosystem. We have to look at, what positions are our athletes spending most of their time in? If they're all sitting down all day long, and then we expect them to extend their hip and cut, you're going to get what you get, and if athletes have been being tackled and are squatting heavy and their quads are stiff and they don't have any hip extension, what do you think is going to happen when they turn and cut with the foot turned out? And if, they're driving in the scrum and feet aren't straight and they're turned out like ducks and the arch collapses and the knee becomes valgus and that Achilles pulls off axis. I mean, what did you think was going to happen? And I think the problem is we have confused the fact sometimes that because the body is a very robust system, we haven't been clear about sort of defining technique around good mechanics of the body. I mean, we teach a lot of technique in rugby. I mean, go to a rugby practice if you've never been to one and watch how many drills you do about tossing and catching and like it's so many drills. You don't just turn guys loose to play ball, right?
Yeah.
No, and one of the things around that then is, well, why aren't we taking positional competency and making that a skill? Running is a skill, being able to put your arms over your head, a skill. Being able to, sequence your spine so you end up in a good spinal position when you tackle, skill. We had, it's amazing. We had a couple captains from the women's USA rugby team train with us for a while. They were around in San Francisco, and those girls were just, no one could outwork them, right? But what they really appreciated was that, hey, the conversation gets to evolve beyond let's work harder to, hey, this is a position where you're not competent. And fortunately, the language of modern strength and conditioning is the language of hip hinging, of throwing and catching, of tackling with your head up is AKA front squatting.
Yeah.
And so we can move beyond, hey, you made the pass to, hey, that was a crap throw, right? Or, hey, you squatted the weight up and down to, yeah, you squatted the weight up and down, but your back reversed, your knees came in, your arches were collapsed, And we can start to use the strength and conditioning piece as the decoder ring to be able to understand at slow speeds and very controlled environments what's happening at high speeds and high environments.
Okay, all right. So what on your website you talk about providing the tools to perform basic maintenance on yourself essentially. What are some of those things that you do? What if someone's at home? What can they do individually? And what some of the basic equipment they need?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we've done is we said, hey, look, as long as, you're getting your sleep and you're eating not like a jerk, you're eating like a decent human being, and, you're training really hard, your excuse.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you just hope that, coaches warm up is good enough so that you can hit those positions. If we look at, how a lot of typical sports are, the professional teams will ask me, hey, we want you to evaluate our warm-up, right? So we can take some NFL examples, for example. And, I'm like, well, I've seen enough of these. And I'm like, well, how long is it? And they're like 8 minutes, and I'm like, I don't know how you got a 100-kilo guy warmed up to tackle another human being in 8 minutes, but I don't know if that's even possible, right? And so, what we really see is that a lot of times we're asking athletes, our warm-up should just be warming up, shifting blood from stomach to tissues, getting things perfused, waking up the nervous system, right, getting hot and sweaty, starting to shift on those aerobic, machineries. Instead, a lot of us are relying on these warm-ups to reclaim positions that I should have all the time. And so one of the things that we should be doing is spelling out for our athletes, if someone came in and was out of shape, you would nail them, right? If someone comes in without full dorsiflexion, we're like, it's fine. You can't flex your ankles, and you're going to squat like crap. And every time you get up off the ground, your knee comes in, and we're like, that's pass. And I think if someone came in, really, really weak, we would say the same conversation. Or if someone was just eating pizza and chips, we'd say the same thing. Yeah. But now we've done a better job of, one, explaining to athletes what the bookmarks of range of motion function are, right? In the language that athletes speak: squat, deadlift, hip hinge, right? Press, bench, all those things. And now we can become a little more sophisticated about having the athlete understand what's full, what's complete, what's not complete, and then also how to take a crack at improving those range of motions in the context of training. So we never pull our athletes out of training, try to get everything perfect, put them back in. We're training while we treat. We're training while we kind of improve positions. Yeah. And this is an important concept because, you should always be able to put your arms over your head without warming up. Like our joke is, leopards don't stretch. Leopards can attack and defend at full physical capacity. Right? You shouldn't have to activate your glutes and, clean up your thoracic spine every single time you're going to put your arm over your head. And that's basically how we're living. We're living in this little kind of compressed box, and we should realize that we should have range of motion available to us all the time. The warm-up should just be the warm-up, which means that also, during the course of the season or injury, man, it's going to be a moving target, Brutal 2 weeks of practice. I'm going to look beat up and skinny, for lack of a better word, at the end of those 2 weeks. And I need to have a plan as an athlete to understand what my own limitations are and understand when things are stiff or aren't sliding right or I don't have range of motion in my ankles. I should be able to fix that as a moving target and as part of the conversation. And what we see is that athletes don't know what good positions are. They don't know how to train. They can work really hard, and then they also don't know how to take care of any of their tissues. And so, we're like, well, how long has your knee been hurting? Well, I don't know, 3 months. And you're like, good God, and did you notice that your quads were really stiff and you don't know how to sequence your spine? And, and it's not. We've just been passing the buck on. And really, this is largely, I think, a product of the fact that by the time we get to college or pro levels, that athletes they come from somewhere. And one of the great things about some of the more sophisticated academy-based programs, like Adelaide does a great job of this, is that, they work in the region to develop athletes. So they get to have touches on those younger athletes. Mm-hmm. This is what we expect you should be able to do. This is, and so by the time those athletes grow up to be pros, they understand how to eat, how to sleep, They've seen what a professional environment. We expect higher movement quality. Their jumping and landing and cutting is better, right? We just have to start this earlier, because what's happening is that all our pro guys come from a system, and if you're lucky to have the support and the resources, then you end up, a little bit more literate as a pro athlete, or playing at a high level. But most of us just blunder our way along until we break, and then we're like, whoa! I have a shoulder impingement. I tore this Achilles. I tweaked my knee. Herniated a disc. Some of it's contact sport, and some of it is the fact that we've been moving poorly at speed for a long time.
For a long time, yeah, for sure. Like I said in the intro there, you did a bit of work in the UK. You've worked with individual players, a little bit with Harlequins. What was some of the stuff that you did there in a bit more detail on the field and in the classroom?
Well, one of the things that we try to help, all of these teams are very sophisticated, they have wonderful, wonderful sports med program. The coaches, the strength coaches are good. Players are willing. What we have to do is continue to work to simplify the athletic experience for the athlete, right? So that the athlete is free to be a human being, not just be in some kind of 24-hour, bubble of, performance, right? But that means also, conjoining systems, streamlining. And for us, the best place to spot movement dysfunction and see issues is at the strength and conditioning level, the people who are actually doing the coaching. And a lot of times helping the coaches be able to integrate positional quality into the strength and conditioning, into the training, helping athletes have a buy-in time where they can smash or roll or do some down regulation, or, open up their hips, that sort of thing, but in the context of greater efficiency. So a lot of times we're able to come in and help bridge the gap, because most of the physios, even though they're really competent, as injuries, aren't educated in the language of strength and conditioning, right? So we're not doing sometimes a good job of reconciling sports medicine with performance training. And there are people who are doing a great job, but helping kind of, because we're happen to be physios and coaches, it's useful for us because we can see on both sides of the fence, right? And so, one of the things we do with a lot of our pro teams, and is that we try to get them to put a treatment table in the gym, so that the treatment, athletes aren't hiding their injuries, which is very, very common. Because if you go down the physio sports med route, sometimes it feels like as an athlete you may never come out, and we're talking about your professional contract, and it's really a slippery slope. And the person who can see that and manage those things and be able to address them in real time is a strength and conditioning coach, right? But if the physio puts the table in the gym, then and creates space, has enough space where they're not just putting out fires all the time, but then somehow when you're squatting and you see a guy who clearly has an impinged hip because he doesn't have full range of motion in his hips, that's something you can jump on right on the spot, right? And that we can then start to evaluate athletes in the situ, in the situations where we're already seeing them move, and we can figure out what's going on. And that's what we, instead of wait till you break and then try to put the flames out and then get you back on the field, and part of this is retraining athletes to understand that it's not just, we can't just create an environment of what we call plausible deniability, because traditionally what we've seen is that as long as athletes feel like they outworked everyone, then they always have a thing to point back to if they get injured, or if they overtrained, or like, well, look at how hard I was working, it's not my fault, versus, hey, we need to improve the quality of that, and guys like Pavel, Satsang have been saying this forever. How strong do you need to be? If you can double back squat your body weight, double body weight your back squat, you're probably strong enough. You really are. But the efficiency there can always be improved. And how can we, make sure that we respect that the most important thing we can do is play, right? That skill at speed playing is the most important thing. So it really comes down to a step backwards to saying, well, how do we create a ready state for those athletes to be able to play more and remain the freshest? And and there's been a lot of really good research that's come out looking at footballers and even rugby players about shifts in training loads, And that that when we know that when we keep training loads high, it's actually good inoculation for athletes to be able to handle spikes in training or spikes in competition. But when athletes are in low training loads and then, have to spike for competition, then we know that that's a recipe for sort of impending disaster. So once again, how do we keep athletes being able to perform at high levels of work and be as fresh as possible? Well, that's also a conversation about efficiency and a greater conversation about the environment in which that athlete exists.
Yeah. And I like that about having the table in the weight room. Kind of removes the stigma too of going to see the physio, and you'd probably get immediate results as well. If they do have an impinged hip, fix it up, go and squat again and see the difference, and you get that athlete buy-in.
And what ultimately happens then is a lot of the mobilization tools that we prescribe are self-directed iterations of how the physio treats the athlete. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if something's not working, the athlete can go do maybe 80 to 90% effectiveness, try to take a crack at improving their positional competency, and then put it right back into the treatment, right back into the training. Hey, I'm warming up. We're benching today. Hey, your shoulder's translating forward a lot as you bench. Oh, can you see that? Yes, great. Hey, my T-spine is stiff. So in between warm-up sets, guys are fixing it, or we only max out when we know it's feeling good. But if we're not feeling good, that's something that we can then correct and work on the spot. And for example, there's a really good case study for how this works, and that's over at the World Athletics Center in Phoenix under the tutelage of Dan Pfaff. And I know you guys have some rugby guys who go there, and their physios and chiros are right next to the track with a table. Sweet. So when an athlete is talking about something not working or they're feeling, they can have this conversation, develop a language, fix it, put the athlete back out. And maybe that doesn't work as well in team sports, but we still have the weight room as the place to be able to do those things.
Yeah, right. And with your work in rugby, was there any specific kind of areas, or is it more general? Like I'm thinking like positionally, like a tight end prop, is there an area of mobility that they should be focusing on more than, say, a winger who's probably a little lighter but runs 3 times as fast?
Well, what's nice is that we can reduce, you're going to see individual variations, of course, but one of the nice pieces around rugby is that the fundamental movements are relatively the same. It's an issue of like, hey, this guy needs to be a lot stronger. This guy needs to be faster with a bigger set of lungs, but the demands remain the same. What we do see is that all the kids who play rugby, especially early on, they have really well-defined training ages. Like they've been lifting weights for a long time. Yeah. Right? Are pretty robust players and robust kids. And for example, when we compare that to some of our professional footballers, like soccer. Yeah. Those kids they've been playing, their sport for, decades, but their training age is very low. And what we see is that, you get a kid who's 16, 17, 18, 19, they have already been squatting and deadlifting and swinging and, for a long time. But what that does potentially is set up a situation where we see very stiff athletes. Yeah. And one of the hallmarks of rugby is your ability to be able to dissociate your upper body from your lower body, right? That is rugby 101. I need to be able to run and turn and throw and catch and receive, right? Yeah. And what we're seeing is, if your hips are stiff, that means you have to turn your whole body, right? Yeah. You can't just dissociate. If your T-spine is stiff, remember the bulk of your rotation to your upper body comes from your thoracic spine, and of course your thoracic spine's stiff because you tackle people and squat heavy and get in the scrum. Then where are you turning when you run? You're turning your whole body. Now you're running sideways versus turning your torso, being able to pivot at the hip. And so we're always, part of our language of performance is we're always looking at rotational capacity of the joint. People are sometimes we'll just put in quotation marks, competent in planar motions, but when we look at like the interrotation of the hip and flexion, they have none, right? I mean, zero, negative range of motion there. And then we're surprised that they have to squat with their feet turned out, or they have to tackle with their feet turned out. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing I'm like, well, let's take that off the table. And then these other things will just improve themselves. And the reason is that, technique around specific positionings or specific skills is rarely very divergent from good physiology, which means that when we teach people to sequence, if you know how to deadlift, that's the sequence for getting in the scrum, right? We prioritize the spine. How many times do you see a guy on a barbell, round their back and then perfectly flatten out into a position before they pull? It's difficult. Why? Because there are going to be so many strains on that system, right? So what I should be able to do is prioritize my spine, hip hinge, get into my best position to generate force. But if you don't have the hip range of motion, you can't bring your knee to your chest and missing hip flexion, then anytime you get past 90 degrees, you're going to see that you start to compromise the transmission of the energy from that hip through the spine, through a rounded spine. You cannot have a slinky for a spine. And so, and yet that's what we regularly see. I mean, look at the low backs of guys in the scrum, and I guarantee you're going to see that pattern reproduced in the gym when they squat or in the gym when they pull off the ground. And so the goal here again is to be able to improve those things so that we can take the handbrakes off and ultimately let the best coaches win. Yeah. Let the best athletes play, not who can manage their range of motion the best.
So for coaches out there who, they may have gone on your website and checked out some of the videos, and there's a lot on there, and there's some great stuff, and but they want to try and incorporate it into their program. Maybe the preseason's beginning in the Northern Hemisphere right now. What would be some advice you'd give them on things like equipment, where to start, and things to keep an eye on in terms of safety and those kind of things?
Well, it's easy to begin anywhere. One of the things that we try to get our performance staff to do is that when we're working with athletes during our warm-ups, that we're spending a lot of time in end range of motion. It's not an accident that you see a lot of lunging as part of a warm-up plan, right? Typically. And the reason is that lunging is an exaggerated version of the end range of motion required for sprinting. And so if you don't spend time in these end ranges, then when you come up to speed where these end ranges are required, you're going to see hot compensation mess. You're going to see, people do not run linearly. Their feet are turned out like ducks. They're striking the ground wrong. So we start with the assumption that, hey, look, if we could just make sure that everyone had good range of motion, watch someone, on the sideline, or throw the ball in, off the side. Watch what happens in their ability to put their arms over their head and develop a good pass in from the sideline. You're going to see elbows flare, right? And partly because that athlete is missing the ability to put their arms over their head, they're throwing in, the rugby ball the only way they can, which is in a terribly weakened position, right? And so there's efficiency to be gained from improving overhead shapes. But if we don't ever spend any time there because we're benching and tackling all the time, and then we expect our athletes to be competent when they tackle overhead, no wonder that the foosh, the fall on an outstretched arm out over your head, is a dislocating injury for a lot of athletes because they don't have any range of motion trying to get their arm over their head. So suddenly when they go land with an outstretched arm or try to tackle like that, there's a lot of energy that gets backed up into a car accident in the shoulder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So one of the things that we're trying to say is, hey, look, during our warm-up, these are positions. Let's make sure that we're touching full range of motion in our athletes, and that's a great place to start. And there's plenty of information about that. Let's make sure that our athletes are at least working in those shapes. And then, you can start a conversation anywhere about, basic soft tissue health, about addressing your pain, you don't need a lot of equipment. You don't need a lot of, very sophistication. And our model is, if you can get our athletes to do 10 or 15 minutes, doesn't even have to be congruent 10 or 15 minutes, but we're working on positional quality for 10 or 15 minutes a day, that's enough, right? Because what we'd rather you do is spend a lot of time getting hot and sweaty, develop your skills. Let's not spend a whole bunch of time rolling around on foam rollers. That's not the best use of it.
And I think that's maybe where there might be some confusion with some coaches as well. And, we've got to have them, playing and practicing the sport they're actually participating in, and checking off some of the other boxes as well where we can. Well,
and the problem is, as a coach, you inherit that athlete from somewhere, and And what I can tell you is that our experience is when we train the athletes and pass them off, the coaches are very grateful because our athletes are ready to be coached. And as the performance staff, one of the things we're trying to do is get rid of all the other silly BS so that the athlete is then ready to go hit the field and be coached. And because those coaches are experts in the position, they're experts in the game, right? So how do we get the athlete ready to do that? But also realizing that those athletes and those coaches all come from somewhere, and they're coming from somewhere is an experience. What do they know? And what we need our coaches ultimately to be able to do is, in spite of the fact that they may be experts in just a position or a field or an idea, is they need to understand what they're seeing. And the best way to do that is also to be in the gym and watch how their athletes are moving in very formal situations.
Yeah.
Because, if you can't overhead, if you can't front squat, I guarantee you're going to have a harder time running and cutting.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, and you mentioned a little bit earlier on about some resources. Obviously, your website, mobilitywod.com, and Becoming a Supple Leopard. Where would you direct coaches other than those two?
Well, I would say, one of the mistakes I think is a lot of times, the performance staff, like the rehab staff, aren't actual lifters, right? They don't actually train hard, right? They may have a different sport, and they're not necessarily in the gym training alongside the athletes. And if we had our coaching staff spending more time with their athletes in the gym, then they would understand a little bit more of why their athletes are having a hard time getting into a certain position or receiving a certain coaching cue. Because a lot of coaching turns out to be, coaching around a problem. So the coach doesn't know how to solve the problem, but the coach has 27 drills to ultimately go around a problem instead of just fixing the problem, right? And I think one of the things that, is a huge formality around this is that most coaches do not have, a formal movement practice of their own. They exercise a little bit, or they're former athletes. And being able to coach powerlifting and Olympic lifting, those things really are helpful to be able to understand and make sense of bodies at speed and at play. And that's where the big disconnect is, so that we see this as a continuum of formalness versus high speed virtuosity, because that's really, playing is being able to, chunk large amounts of dynamic information and respond quickly. And there's only one way to get really good at that, and that's to play at speed, right? Yeah. So that means that it's also, as a coach, I'm doing that stuff. I'm looking at the macro, and if my athletes are, worried about their feet position instead of tackling or trying to get into a better shape, like, we've also failed. So at some point we need to put movement skill into the program, and that's part of the warm up. That can be part of the cool down, that can be play, but also that belongs in the strength and conditioning environment. Like, you see athletes and their feet aren't straight when they strike the ground and they're running with their feet turned out. You're waiting for, accident up the kinetic chain.
Absolutely. All right, cool. I'm a teacher, and I can't let you go without talking about your awesome program that you and your wife started up, standupkids.org. It's got nothing to do with rugby, but it's probably linked to a lot of the problems we see with athletes and their range of motion. Do you want to give us a little spiel about standupkids.org and what it is?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. We came to care about sitting and ergonomics and posture because we were recognizing that a lot of the athletes we were working with, had a common sequela of problems. Short hip, they're sitting overextended, calves, we just saw a whole bunch of, stiff upper thoracic spine. And if we're going to do the due diligence of saying, hey, look, we have to create an ecosystem, an environment where the athlete or the person can just be a person, then how is that typical athlete spending, the bulk of their day? And honestly, these kids are spending 10 to 12 to 14 hours a day sitting in a compromised position. It's crazy. And we started working with the military, trying to help them solve back pain in some elite military units. We started working with colleges around some of this stuff. And the data freaked us out, and we ultimately, fast forward, when we were working at field day with our kids at their little school, it's the game, everyone has a field day at their school in elementary, right? And you play sports and games. Well, we were running the sack race. And what we noticed is that kids did not have the range of motion to pick their hip up high enough to get in the sack.
Wow.
So here we are, and kids are they don't even have 90 degrees of hip flexion. Like, I don't care who you are, what the hell? And then we also noticed that a lot of the kids lacked the ability to extend the hip violently to hop in the sack.
Wow.
Right? They were basically folded over at the waist trying to hop. And we were like, here's the expression. And we went and talked to our principal and said, hey, look, we've been doing this with the military, universities, with corporations. Would you be amenable to us, putting in, a classroom or so as a test? We think this is really something. And the preliminary research is really powerful. And she was like, yep, no problem. And so we adopted a couple classrooms, 4 classrooms, and that turned into last year the entire school. And our daughters were the first all-moving school in the world. And I want to qualify that because it's not that we want kids to be cashiers. We're trying to set up environments that fit the physiology, and we're supposed to be in constant motion. So if the environment allows for more fidgeting, allows for more range of motion, kids can sit on the ground. There's a fidget bar at the bottom of the desk that allows them to pivot. Each desk is individualized to the height of the child. It's quickly and easily adjustable. And so what we see is we have an environment that matches the physiology. And we saw common patterns, and this is backed up by the experience of running coaches and what the development says. But kids, go watch a whole bunch of kindergartners run, and they all run like sprinters. They all run like Usain Bolt, all of them, right? And then halfway through the first grade, half of those kids start heel striking. And you can't sprint heel striking. It's a completely dysfunctional pattern, and one that kindergartners and begin the first grade, they don't express. And so what we were seeing is fundamental changes in motor program, motor patterning, learning happening as a function of this insidious environmental load. And so we took on the school, taken on the rest of the school district. We partnered with this incredible company called Donors Choose. And to date, we have about 35,000 kids in the U.S. standing moving stations.
Wow,
and
awesome.
The research is coming out that they followed about 400 or 500 kids in Texas for a couple of years, and they were able to show that standing interventions had a decrease in percentage BMI by over 5%.
Wow.
And so turns out that kids, basically, this is one of the solutions that can help us with this childhood obesity piece. But more importantly, watch your kids sit on the sideline and tell me that winning, collapsed, crappy posture, forward head on neck, rounded T-spot, tell me that's the position you want your athlete to play in.
Yeah, no, it's brutal, eh? Oh, that's great. And I get my guys up and moving around as often as I can, and
exactly.
I want to get the equipment, the stand-up desk and everything like that, and I let them sit down on the floor cross-legged when they want.
Yeah.
The kids love it. They're right into it. All
right.
right.
They intuitively get it. And that's what I can tell you is that, and especially when we give kids options or give students options to, because sitting down, we shouldn't fear it. You just can't do it 24/7. And here's the problem. Where we look at the school day and we look at the work day, but that's not what the rest of us are doing. We're also on our smartphones, bent in half, for 2.5 hours a day. We're on the computer, we're watching the Netflix, and all of that aggregates into a human being that basically isn't moving enough, and a human being that's spending most of their time in non-athletic shape.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times do you have to say tackle with your chest up? Imagine if you didn't practice tackling with your head down by being on the computer all day long. It would be a radical transformation.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, we always end the show with the same 4 closing questions. I'm going to modify it for you because of your upbringing as a kid. You wouldn't have watched a lot of rugby as a kid, but when you were growing up as a kid, who was one of your favourite athletes running around?
I was a high-level ski racer as a kid. I tried to be. I grew up in Europe, and watching all Herman Zubbergen and Tomba, I mean, those guys, those are my heroes early on.
Herman Meyer was amazing.
Oh, man. Exactly right. And, I'd say, watching one of the things that was really great for me, I came from this really formal ski racing background and kayaking background.
Yeah.
And it taught me to feel what was happening in my body, to anticipate what was going on in this dynamic environment in front of me and make decisions. And that translates brilliantly to field sports because you have input, you're reacting to things that are happening, and you're planning ahead. And this is why I think if we want kids to be really good at field sports, it helps when they have a sliding sport.
Yeah.
When they have a sport like, they can skateboard, they can ski, they can rugby, they can ice skate, something like that really does help them get better at field sports.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and what about now? Who's your favourite athlete going around, or rugby player, if you have any names?
Well, what I really love is the homage to the fact that rugby has become in the United States so much more of an egalitarian sport. We're seeing, because I think you can play rugby for a long, long time, and it doesn't take a lot of equipment, and really puts a premium on being well conditioned in a way that some of our other power sports do not. And I think we're going to see more and more good athletes, spin off from football and play more rugby as there's more money and people can make a professional living at it.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I think if anyone watched the USA women's side in the Olympics, they were unbelievable the way they had a rough first day, but the second day the rugby they were playing was epic.
It's pretty fun. It's fun. It's fun to see. I just think it's great. And, we know women who are playing in these tackle football leagues, and I feel like this. We think that's great also. But teaching people how to contact and tackle and interact this way it's brilliant. It's brilliant for girls. It's brilliant for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. Both my girls are 6 and 3, and they're in mini rugby. So
I love it. And I just want to give a shout out to Rugby USA. Like this, I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful program. Just props to those guys.
Yeah, they've been at it for a while now, and they're getting some great results. So yeah. Okay, so and last two questions. Who's one of your favourite high-profile coaches that you like what they do?
I am lucky that I work with a lot of really clever, smart coaches on the planet. I will tell you that what I think is one of the most difficult jobs right now is being at the university and managing, athletes with two full-time professions, sports and and academics.
Yeah.
And you get kids from high school who maybe aren't very sophisticated, and you have to also get them ready to play. I'm always going to give a shout out to Stanford and Shannon Turley and what he's doing down there and his staff. If I could give some major love, I'm going to give love to all of the college strength and conditioning coaches who are working their asses off to get kids literate enough and supportive enough. I mean, I just think that's a really tough job and where we need to be putting a ton of money and energy in, because a lot of times this is the end of the road for those kids, and they come out and they, in bad programs they're injured, and in good programs they come out and are better for it.
Yeah, absolutely. They got the rest of their life to get on with it. Okay, and someone who's maybe, and lastly, someone lesser known, someone chipping away at the grassroots who you think's doing a great job.
I can't throw any one of my friends under the bus just because of what's going on. But I will tell you that two of my friends, Brian McKenzie and Laird Hamilton, surfer, have started a program along with Gabby Reese. They've started a program called XPT Life.
Yeah.
And what they're realizing is that, hey, there's a lot of money to be made, as in like capacity gained by teaching athletes how to downregulate, how to turn that system off.
Yeah.
I was seeing, just as an aside, I saw an interview with an All Blacks player who's saying he was having a hard time. Sometimes after matches, stay up till 4 a.m. playing Xbox. And that's a sign that we have not taught an athlete how to turn off and recover.
Yeah.
Because they're so amped. We're so good at getting up, and we're crap at getting down. And ultimately, the nervous system, is the limiter. And I'll tell you, guys like Mark Uyama, who's the strength and conditioning for the 49ers, he's head coach there, is really so clever about managing the realities of professional sports, keeping an eye on movement quality, getting guys prepared, and helping them understand how to turn off. But Laird Hamilton, Brian McKenzie, go to XPT Life. Just the breathing work, the static hold work, the water work, all of it can really help athletes become much better.
That's huge, yeah.
And that's really should be one of the things that as performance coaches or as coaches in a field, we should be looking around saying, what are other people doing in other fields around human performance that we can steal back in? Because it's so complicated once you're in the day-to-day trenches to have enough time to to try to be innovative. And I think what's really great is that people have already solved a lot of problems for you if you're looking at other systems.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Laird Hamilton and his big wave stuff he does. He's a freak.
He is. So take a look at
Check it out.
what he and Brian are doing with the XPT Life, because that's an easy thing to drop in some breathing, and all of a sudden we've improved ventilation performance. We've improved your ability to create high intra-abdominal pressure when you tackle. I mean, just a whole bunch of things happen around that.
That's awesome. I'll put it in the show notes for sure. All right. Well, it's been great chatting to you. It's been really informative, and I'm sure coaches are going to get a bunch out of it. So, just want to thank you again for giving up your time and having a chat with us.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, man.
Yeah, no worries. Cheers, guys.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review via iTunes and keep listening for the next episode. You can also follow us on Twitter at RugbyCoachSCNR or via the website at therugbycoachescorner.com. Until next time, keep sharing ideas to make the game better.